I work primarily as an apologist evangelist. If you don't know what an apologist is, people say it doesn't mean you go around apologizing. It doesn't. It comes from the Greek word that Peter uses in 1 Peter 3:15 in the New Testament. You'll remember the verse, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope within, and do it with gentleness and respect. You know the verse? And that word that we translate to give an answer is the Greek word apologia. And really it was taken by, Paul uses it as well to describe his ministry. It was taken by the writers of the New Testament from a context of, a defense lawyer would stand up in a court and would speak on behalf of the person in the dock. And what they do in that process of defending their client is described as giving an apologia. It's like a legal defense. So it's really trying to speak about the Christian faith in a way that is persuasive. After all, when you're a lawyer in a courtroom, you're trying to persuade people of the truth. It's describing, speaking about the Christian faith in a way that is kind of reasoned, but also engaging with the questions that, or the sort of suspicions or issues that people have with the faith. So most of the time, I'm speaking more to a kind of skeptical audience. This week I was in York at the university there with a team, and we were doing a week of events, speaking about who Jesus is, trying to do lunchtime talks on questions that people have about the Christian faith and then answer their questions. And we saw over 40 people come to Christ. The Christian Union is probably only about 50, so they've nearly doubled in size. That's great. And we had around 140 give their details and say they want to do a follow-up course, which is really exciting, I think, in the UK to see in a secular context where we're constantly hearing about the rise of atheism and the challenge of Islam and all of that. So that's a little bit about me. Yes, also married. My husband is a church leader, so I'm involved in helping him plant a church. We've been doing that for 2 years. So we're in Buckinghamshire now, between sort of London and Oxford. Before that, we spent 7 years in the inner city in Peckham, in southeast London, which was a hugely formative time in my evangelism, but also in dealing with some of the questions about suffering and violence and those sorts of questions that we saw in a very practical way day to day. So I'm going to say a few words, and then I would actually really love you to be thinking about what questions you would like us to deal with in this session. We've got 45 minutes, I think. Is that right? And in the second session, we're going to be looking at whether we can trust the Bible, and I'm going to share with you, those of you who want to stay for that, some of the newer research that has been coming out that really deals with people like Bart Ehrman and the kind of skeptical people who say, the New Testament was just written by random people years after the event. Some of the newer research that has come out showing really why we know the Gospels are eyewitness testimony, as well as some other evidences there. So if you do have your Bibles, why don't we just open them at 1 Peter 3:15. I'll read that. Be thinking of what questions you'd like to ask. Muster up your courage. And I'll say a few words about this. In your heart, set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope within. I wonder how you feel when you hear those words. Notice the assumption that you will be living in such a way that your life causes people around you to ask questions. The assumption is that being a Christian is so radically countercultural and different from the people around you, and so provocative, either attractive or repulsive, that it will cause people to question why and what is it that's different about you. It's challenging, isn't it? For me, this takes various forms. My job takes me into different contexts, different universities or political settings or business settings where people invite me to come and speak about a question that people are asking. So last year, some Christians who work on Capitol Hill in DC said, we'd like you to come and talk about the issue, the question, has the Christian faith failed? Is it a failed hope? Now, in the context of America, with the culture wars and the church being very much associated with a particular political position and the fragmentation of society and a new rising generation who are completely disillusioned with the Christianity that they've seen, that was the question that they asked. And I said, okay, I was very nervous. It was going to be on Capitol Hill in the main building in Congress, next to in a big room, the caucus room next to the debating chamber. And they said, we're hoping that we'll get between 30 and 50 people, and we want you to speak to non-believers and then take questions. So we don't know how many we'll get. We've never had more than 60 people come to one of these meetings, so who knows? So I got there, and the night before, I was just reading through my emails. I was doing an event at American University as well on whether God exists, and read through my email saying we've had 319 RSVPs. They were doing a lunch, and all sorts of people are coming from both sides of the house, and hope you're ready, sort of thing. I thought, oh, gosh, that was a question that really struck the hearts of those people. So what are the questions that you are being asked? Keep that in mind. One of the questions that I'm asked a lot is, you seem to love God, and you obviously like going to church. This is more sort of with my friends where I live, like mums at the school gate kind of thing. But, and that's really nice for you, and I'm really glad you've got that. But, why is that relevant to me? Don't know if any of you have that, friends who think, basically what's behind that is the idea that, Christianity is a not particularly sophisticated form of wish fulfillment. I like the tennis club, or I like, socializing with my friends, and you're a slightly strange person who likes church. And you have a desire for God to exist, and religion is basically wish fulfillment. It's psychological projection. It's a delusion that you indulge in, and it makes you happy. So that's nice for you, but it's totally irrelevant to me. I wonder how many of us have friends in that category. So I was talking with a friend about this, and I was saying, well, that's really interesting, but I think it is more than that. My own story is that my grandfather was a committed atheist, an atomic scientist who lived in East Germany and escaped Russian occupation, came here to the UK, got out of East Germany via MI6, came here to the UK to work as a scientist, forbade my grandmother from having a Bible in the house. My father never read the Bible, was not allowed to mention God. So the culture of our family is inherited atheism. It was only when Christ broke into my father's life at the age of 35, when he himself was a university lecturer, and he began to consider the question of whether this is actually true, that the course of our family life changed, and I was introduced to even the idea of God. Are there good reasons to believe in God, said my friend. I said, yeah, I can think of 5. The cosmological reason. The fact that something exists rather than nothing, and that the universe around us is so extraordinary and complex and intelligible, rational. Dawkins was recently debating, it's all on YouTube at the moment, it's all over Facebook if you watch these things, and he was speculating that because of the appearance of design in the universe, it's probable or possible that we were created by aliens, by an intelligence, but alien intelligence, trying to promote this as an idea superior to the idea of God, the ultimate intelligence. producing us. The cosmological reason to believe in God, the universe itself points to God, or as the Bible says, the heavens declare the glory of God. Or the ontological reason, ontos is just the Greek word for being. And what that speaks of is metaphysical truths, things like love and thought that can't be confined to a test tube, that transcend material realities. Metaphysical things like thought and love point to the existence of a creator who is capable of thought and love. Or moral reasons to believe in God, not at all saying you have to be a Christian to be moral, but saying to have a foundation for morality. We only really have three options. We have the possibility that morality is completely determined by the individual. You believe something is right because you have a personal feeling about it, and you believe other things are wrong because you have a personal feeling about it. Morality is purely individualistic. Historically, atheists have believed this. Bertrand Russell is a classic of that. Debating with Frederick Copleston, the brilliant Jesuit priest, they were talking about reasons to believe in God, and this moral reason came up. And Copleston said to Bertrand Russell, how if there's no God, how do you tell the difference between good and evil? And Russell said, I tell the difference between good and evil the same way I tell the difference between yellow and green. And Copleston said, well, you tell the difference between yellow and green by seeing. How do you distinguish between good and evil in the absence of God? And he said, on the basis of how I feel. Now, at that point, commentators always say, Copleston got the upper hand, he left it hanging. But my boss, Ravi Zacharias, likes to say, he would love to jump into the pages of that debate and say, well, Lord Russell, in some countries they love their neighbours, in others they eat them. Do you have a personal preference? Morality clearly transcends what the individual feels. We all know of instances of people who feel that what they did was right, and yet it fills us with horror. Think about that Norwegian guy killing all of those people on a moral crusade, doing what he believed was right. So that's one option. Another option, social contract theory. Morality has evolved as societies have grown more sophisticated. We have developed moral systems. So we don't need a God to tell us what's good and evil. We've just come up with those ideas as societies. Morality does not need God, it just needs the law. Now, for us as Christians, that's an interesting one. And even for us as Europeans, that's an interesting one. You think about how recently doing incredibly horrific things has been legal. The defense at the Nuremberg trial springs to mind, when the SS accused of the mass killing of Jewish people said, we were just following orders. What we did was legal. We were in the German army, given orders by the democratically elected government of our country. What we did was legal. How can you now come along and say what we did was wrong? Or you have the possibility that there is a God who created the universe, who is the moral lawgiver, who judges between right and wrong, and who's the final arbiter. And it's only if you believe in God that you have a foundation for morality that is absolute, that transcends the individual or the society. That's a great reason to believe in God. And there's been a big shift in philosophy departments over the last 50 years, largely based on that moral argument. Now we can come back and say, well, in conversation with atheists and Christians, the grounds of debate has shifted, even in the last 15 years, away from, is there such a thing as good and evil? Dawkins will tell you there's no such thing as good and evil. He says, in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky. You won't find any rhyme or reason for it or any purpose. There is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. We just dance to its music. That's what he writes. Some atheists will still go for that. We can't say anything is right or wrong. One of my friends rang him on a student radio phone-in about this question and asked him, could you say the Holocaust was evil? And he said, no, I can say I don't like it, but I can't say it was wrong. moral categories don't exist in that kind of pure form of atheism. So without God, what is our foundation for morality? That's a great reason to believe in God. A fourth reason would be, and we haven't got time to go into this, the historical evidences for God around the person of Jesus Christ. And you all as Alpha fans will know lots of those. And the fifth reason I gave my friend was the personal reason that I can say that I've met God and encountered him in the person of Christ, my personal testimony. Now, that might not be persuasive alone to a friend who's very skeptical, but as part of a bigger picture. Do you see how all of these different kinds of data, scientific, cosmological, philosophical, ontological, moral, historical, personal, very few other worldviews can make any kind of claim that touches on those different areas of reality. If you look at a religion like Islam, you have the idea of a prophet who speaks with authority, and a book that is in heaven, co-eternal with God, which is sent down to earth via a prophet. But not a sense of a historical apologetic with eyewitnesses and claims staked in history. Much more of an assertion, you just must believe it because of this individual. Or you look at a religion like Buddhism, which is very philosophical, but makes really very little claim about cosmology or history or even personal experience, since the goal of Buddhism is to find nothingness, oneness with ultimate reality. So you see, we need to understand how unique and exciting the Christian faith is and how persuasive it is. And to learn how, like Peter says, to be able to give reasons for the hope within us. That's what giving an apologetic is. So I've talked for long enough without letting you ask questions. That was just a little introduction, really. Some of you look a bit mesmerised and stunned. Sorry, I apologise. What I'd love to do is keep questions about the Bible for the second session, because we're going to do a whole thing on that. But to just open the floor up, because I could talk to you about war in the Old Testament. I could talk to you about science and faith. We could talk about suffering. We could talk about psychology. There are so many questions that people have today, but I'd love to hear what the questions burning in your hearts are. What are the questions that people are coming to you and asking that they, what's the reason for the hope within? Or here's my objection to your hope within. So who would like to be brave and raise a question? Yes. Okay. Great question. You say that Jesus is the only way to God. So what happens to everybody else? Is that the question? Okay. Great question. Oh, I love that question. I had that this week with somebody. Depending on how long we have to spend with someone, I would start with looking at the idea of truth claims, because behind this question is sort of a feeling that Christians are unique in making a truth claim that excludes other people. Okay, so the idea is, that there's this neutral space in Britain, which most people occupy. Let's say 90% of the population occupy neutral territory. They're not making any claim on anybody or any exclusive claim. And then there are these Christians over here, and a few Muslims and Hindus as well, but basically Christians who are saying, we're right and all of you are wrong, which sounds incredibly intolerant and arrogant. But us here in the centre ground, we're not making any claims at all. Now, obviously, that is totally fallacious. Everybody has a perspective on truth and reality. I remember running an Alpha course in the 90s with my then boyfriend, and I were running a table. We're now married. And it was after a mission, and we had 8 students on our table, all of whom were not believers, and the 2 of us. And this one person in particular was very vocal. You know the Alpha rules that say you're not meant to answer any questions. You just let people talk. And so we did that for the whole first week. Sorry, Nikki, we managed it for 1 week. And he was saying, Jesus is electrifying. I feel myself drawn to Jesus. But then Buddha's fantastic as well, and Muhammad. And, there's the sevenfold path to enlightenment in Buddhism, and I'm really interested in that. And isn't it great that there are all these religious claims? And we sort of bit our lip and thought, 4 weeks into the course, this was carrying on. He was a real leader, this guy, and everybody was sort of nodding on. And my husband, Frog, said to him, I want you to go away this week and think about a question. Here's the question. In John 14, and we talked about whether we could trust the words written in the Bible, and he sort of thought broadly you could. Jesus claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life, and he said, no one comes to the Father except through me. What do you think of that statement? Do you think Jesus was right or that he was wrong when he said it? And this guy said, everybody's right. Jesus is right, Buddha's right, Muhammad's right, Krishna's right, everybody's right. Frog said, no, I want you to go away and think about this for a week and come back and tell me your answer. The next week came. He looked terrible, this guy. And one of the other students said, you look bleeping awful. What's wrong with you? And he said, well, I've been thinking about that question over and over and over. I've been thinking about it. His whole objection to the Christian faith is exactly what is behind your question. I can't sign up to something that excludes people and says that other people are wrong. I don't want to be the intolerant bigot who puts themselves with other intolerant bigots in judgment over other people. So I never want to say someone else is wrong. That is my bottom line. So the other students teased out of him and said, well, what conclusion did you come to? Was Jesus right or was he wrong when he said it was the only way to God? And he said, and I'm not joking, he said, when Jesus said that, I think he was. And he took a big intake of breath. Everybody hung. And he said, wrong. There, I've said it. Now, that night, I don't know if any of you know Oxford, but there's a little road called Pembroke Street. It's a very thin road, and we just danced down Pembroke Street. We were so excited because we knew he was going to become a Christian. You think, that's crazy. But what you see, he had realized the incoherence of his position. He was rejecting Christ, saying, I will not believe in someone who says other people are wrong, whilst he was saying someone was wrong, i.e. Christ and all Christians. Now, if you're going to reject the Christian faith, reject it for a good reason, not a stupid one. You can't on the one hand say, I refuse to believe something that excludes other people whilst you exclude other people. All truth claims do exclude. So even the claim that all paths lead to God, including, Pol Pot, Stalin, and the Norwegian gunman, even saying all paths, even those advocated by madmen, lead to God, excludes its opposite view. It's saying, the one-way idea is wrong and the some ways idea is wrong. The idea actually that, no, we have to draw a line somewhere, but maybe just around the 5 major religions. That excludes the idea of all and one. So that's looking at it from a philosophical point of view, but what about from a personal point of view? How do we respond when people press us and say, are you honestly saying, I'm going to hell or my lovely granny's going to hell if we don't agree with you? See, often in apologetics there are more than 2 dimensions, but there's the philosophical dimension where we can see that's irrational. I can see that I'm excluding Jesus and rejecting him on the basis that I don't want to reject anyone. That's illogical. But the implications personally are a different sphere. Now on that, I would turn to Matthew 6. I would say we need to rely on what we do know and be humble about what we don't know. What we do know is that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. What we do know is that through Christ, we can be utterly confident that we can go to heaven. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. What we don't know is where individual people stand, even people who've died. Let me give you an example. Malcolm Muggeridge, the brilliant Christian commentator who started off as the Jeremy Paxman of his era, a sort of vociferous interviewer, but who found Christ later in life. was one of the few people to really interview Stalin and who got to know Stalin's family. And he interviewed Svetlana Stalin, Stalin's daughter, after he died. And she described her father's death. Now, bearing in mind this is a mass murderer, as we know, and someone, deeply evil, Joseph Stalin. And she said, before he died, he was clearly fading away and he knew he was about to die. Stalin was lying in bed and he suddenly looked up to heaven and his face completely changed and was really animated as if he was having some kind of vision. And he sat up in bed and he shook his fist at heaven and he fell into bed and died. Now, Muggeridge had an interpretation of that. What I would want to say is we need to be very careful. In fact, Jesus explicitly warns us against making eternal judgment calls about individuals because we don't know the details. So when Jesus says in Matthew 6, don't judge, God is the judge. We're not to put ourselves in the position of saying, you're going to hell and you're not. We can say what we do know. Those who will trust Christ can be confident of heaven. But what we don't know is who is trusting Christ, what vision they're about to have or have had before they've died, what knowledge they've had, and what opportunity they've had to respond to the gospel. I would also say in Romans 1, we have very much a sense of God's justice and fairness and his revelation of himself in creation, in the natural order, and a sense that we need to trust him with those that we love, and we need to be faithful in proclaiming the gospel. It's not an opt-out. It's not saying people don't need to hear about Jesus. But at some point, we have to turn that question of their eternity to him. So if someone asks me directly, I will say, we can be totally confident that those who will receive the forgiveness of Jesus, that he's the only way, he's the one come from God, we can't be good enough, etc. But if people push me to say, what about so-and-so, what about so-and-so, I'll say, well, I'm forbidden from doing that. I'm not the judge. I don't know their heart. I don't know your heart. But what I do know is this message. And if you receive his forgiveness, you can be confident of heaven. Yes, question at the back. Brilliant question. Did you hear it? The question is basically the genetic fallacy, for those of you who like these things. The idea that you're a Christian by accident of birth. So you happen to be born in the West, therefore you're a Christian, but if I was born in Algeria or Libya, I'd be a Muslim. And so the idea is that truth is a product of society and culture. So behind that question is the person's view of what religion is. It's culture, and it's inherited. Now, in the face of that, I think the Christian response to that is twofold. It's philosophical, but it's also sociological. It's philosophical in the sense that Christ's truth claims come to earth in the Middle East, not in the West. Okay? He stakes a claim for our attention through his resurrection, through his walking on the earth, through the Bible, which is then translated into multiple languages, even within the first 2 centuries of the church, as a universal truth claim. That's what it's intended to be, at least. So it needs to be examined on that basis. If we reject it as untrue, that's one thing. But to say it is only culture doesn't sort of do justice to what it is, to what Christianity is. The second thing I would say is that actually you're much more likely to be a Christian if you live in Africa than you are if you live in Britain. You're much more likely to become a Christian at the moment, right now, if you live in China or Iran than if you live anywhere else, which defies the odds. I don't know if you know about the Iranian revival that's happening in the last 10 years. More people have become Christians in Iran than the previous 3 centuries, 3 centuries put together. So my answer to that would be, I often would make a joke of it because my father, having been brought up as an atheist, did go on to become a church minister and say, who are the most likely people to be totally raucous and completely off the rails? It's the children of pastors. We often reject what our parents believe. And in the West now, it's so countercultural for someone in their 20s or 30s to go to church that the idea that there's any inherited religion for younger people is nonsense. So I think we can answer it philosophically by addressing the truth claim and the nature of truth, and then also answer it sociologically, showing that where the church is growing actually is not in the West. How are we doing for time? We've got time for more questions. One at the back, yes. Okay, great question. So the question is, as a comeback to the answer I've just given, might someone not come back and say, well, when those nations do develop, they'll soon wake up and realise that religion is a crutch as well. It's just, it's called, the idea, the secularization thesis, that as people become more civilised, they become more secular. But actually, even the proponents within sociology of the secularization thesis, like the lead thinkers of it in the 60s, have realised that it's a failed project, it's a myth. The idea that as people become more educated, they become more secular has not borne out. It doesn't mean that they become more Christian, but what we're seeing is a massive openness to spirituality and spiritual ideas that may even to us seem utterly crazy, but in highly civilized societies. So I would probably go on that line if someone sort of wanted to respond. But then I would come back as well to the idea of the Christian faith as a truth claim that deserves to be examined in the marketplace of ideas, and that is not saying we are a religion and we want special faith treatment. The Christian faith is claiming to be verifiable in a sense, staked on the resurrection, but all these other reasons as well. Right from the beginning of the church, apologetics has always been done. It's never been about culture or just throw your mind away and embrace this kind of ethereal thing. So to show someone that, and then to show them the evidence and say, why not examine it? You may not agree with it, but at least look at it for what it is, which is a truth claim. Okay. Hands going up everywhere. This is exciting. Let's have one here and then we'll go over there.
And I can't remember the exact title of the book, but it was something like Memoirs of an Imaginary Friend. Now, I have a friend who considers my faith to be something that's quite harmless. It won't do him any harm. He's quite pleased that I've got this imaginary friend, but he doesn't want one. How would you answer that kind of ideology?
It's fascinating how when you really examine that, how insulting it is actually, isn't it? So the idea is, your religious faith is a delusion and it's a total fantasy, and you are stupid enough to believe in it, and that makes you happy. Because it makes you happy, that's okay, And sometimes people even say, "Oh, I wish I had your faith." But I can't, i.e., I just can't make myself as stupid as you so as to believe it. Even though, if it would make me happy, I'd willingly embrace insanity. So with friends like that, I would probe a bit into what they're actually saying and say, it's really interesting that you view it like this. And there are probably reasons why you view belief in God in that way. Could be the Freudian reason. Freud, the brilliant psychoanalyst, who said, there is no God. Human beings have created God out of our need for a father figure to exist. And those who have a desire for an ultimate heavenly father figure project that desire and create God out of their imagination. Now, even at the time, people said to Freud, that argument cuts both ways. We could say, Freud, you're an atheist because you have a desire for a father figure not to exist. You've had a dysfunctional experience of family, therefore you don't want there to be a heavenly father. Therefore you refuse to believe in him despite all the evidence. Your disbelief in a heavenly father figure is a delusion. See, the wish fulfillment argument cuts both ways. Now, that doesn't mean that God is there. It's not a knockdown argument for God, but it levels the ground. And it says, actually, this isn't an issue of what we want to be the case. You desire that there not be a father figure. I desire that there be a father figure. Both desires are irrelevant in the end. The question is there a father figure? Is he there? So come at the question on the basis of evidence and truth rather than wish fulfillment. I think that's probably what I do. And encourage the person to, maybe they're a scientist. So give them something that will actually, scratch where they're itching, or maybe they're interested in history. So I can recommend some books afterwards if people are interested in that. My goodness, we've got hands everywhere. Let's go to the lady here. We haven't had a lady yet.
People often ask the question, if God exists, why does he let bad things happen?
Okay, that's a brilliant question, and one that would take a much longer time than we have together to answer sufficiently. So let me begin by saying that. I think when we talk about the question of suffering, we need to understand that just like all of these questions, there are multiple layers to it. For some people, this is an intensely personal question. I've lost a child or a husband or a father. In the last 2 weeks, I have been talking to a very dear friend who's lost her father, who's asking this question. And last week, I was with a friend whose baby is not going to survive, who's just been born, but he doesn't have the right heart and lung makeup. It's impossible for him to survive. And so when we answer that question or begin to even speak into that question, for someone who is personally enduring suffering, the way we answer that may be different from the way we answer the question to someone who's raising this as a philosophical question. And atheists often do this. It's a knockdown argument for God. They say, if there was a God who's all-loving and all-powerful, there wouldn't be suffering. That leaves us with three options. Either there's a God who isn't powerful. He's loving, but he can't do anything about suffering. He's not powerful, therefore he's not God. Or there's a God who's powerful, but he's not loving, and therefore he doesn't intervene. He could intervene, but he doesn't. Therefore, even if he exists, he's not worthy of being loved or worshipped. So, QED, suffering, you shouldn't worship God. So there's a sort of philosophical angle. Let's just take the personal one first and then come back to the philosophical. How do we speak to people who are in that situation of going through incredible loss or have been violated in some horrific way, and they are asking, why didn't God intervene? Why didn't he prevent this from happening? It's obviously is holy ground when we're talking to someone who's going through that situation. We may point to the Old Testament, we may look in the book of Job, and we will see that there's no theology of karma in the Bible. There's no, you have got what you deserved. You did bad deeds and karma has come round to get you. The book of Job completely draws a big X through the idea of karma, where we see a righteous person suffering. And suffering the loss of children and disease and the loss of property and these horrific things, even though he's a righteous person who's loved by God. Or we see God, the Christian God, again unique in any other worldview, is the God who doesn't just observe suffering and evil as something external to him, but he sees and acknowledges and understands and views. He enters a suffering world and at the cross takes sin, pain, death, suffering into himself. As Paul writes, he who knew no sin became sin for us. The theology of expiation, that Jesus actually bears our sin. You know, the Jewish writer Elie Wiesel very powerfully describes an instance in his concentration camp where two boys were being punished by the Nazis because some tools had been stolen and they were being hung. Am I going over time, by the way? Sorry. They were being hung in front of everybody as a sort of warning to people not to steal. And the Nazis designed it so they died very slowly. It was absolutely horrific. He describes it in his book. And he describes standing there watching these two young men struggling and dying, and the person in front of him says, "Where is God? Where is God?" And he describes feeling this rage rise up in his heart and echoing that, "Yes, God, where are you?" And he hears a voice behind him, but he realizes later that it was in his ear. And the voice says, "Hanging there right next to them, where else?" Only in the Bible do we have a God who identifies with, enters into the suffering world, but doesn't just do that. He takes the suffering into himself, which is why Jesus, before the cross, sweats drops of blood because he's so anxious about what he is to suffer. In contrast with all the Christian martyrs in the Emperor Nero's time who go to their death singing, even while lions are tearing them limb from limb, equally painful to a crucifixion, singing hymns, being set alight as human torches, singing "Praise you, Jesus," with joy. Yet Jesus, when he faces his death, why does he sweat blood? Because at the cross, he's taking sin and evil and pain and suffering into himself and bearing God's judgment, propitiation against those things. Okay, so we have a God who identifies with us, who is with us in suffering, and that's unique. The other thing I would say is I think in our charismatic churches, because we know that God is alive and well and heals and does dramatic miracles, we've lost a theology of the expectation of suffering in the church. So we have the idea that God's love is equated with us not suffering, and we don't read that in the Bible anywhere. And it's interesting to me that where you see the greatest movements of signs and wonders in the world today, like the Chinese church or the Iranian church or the Iraqi church that you've been hearing about, there's also suffering that comes together. So somehow we have to hold the two together. Do I need to stop? Yes. I can see people queuing outside. We're going to continue. If I can just sum up and say the philosophical answer to the question of suffering, we don't have time to do in detail. I've written a book called "But Is It Real?" and there's a chapter on both the two sides of that issue. Or there's a brilliant website called Be Thinking, as in the verb to be, B-E, and then the word thinking.org, which has masses of free apologetics talks and resources. If you're not a big reader, but you can listen to things in the kitchen or in the car or whatever, really encourage you to go and find great resources, like whole talks on these questions that we've looked at, or the website of my organisation, rzim.eu. So there's loads of resources on there. This is such a short snapshot into what apologetics is, but let me encourage you to go out there and equip yourselves with the answers so that when people ask, as Peter says, you'll be ready to give an answer. Thank you for listening.